Looks like we're starting to get some attendees trickle in. We're going to give a little bit more time for anyone else to jump in before we get started. But we're going to we're just going to wait a little bit longer. And this is recorded, so if you have to hop out at any point, you can just review that recording later. We're just going to give one more minute and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for those to those of you who are hopping on in. Right. Thank you to those of you who are joining live, and for those of you who are watching this recording, thank you for watching along. Um, we are here to participate in the latest episode of the Semantic Exchange. This is a webinar Ask the Expert series where we have some authors of recent publications come on in to speak about their work and answer some questions. You're likely already familiar with Enterprise Knowledge's knowledge base, which I invite you to take a look at after this. But we wanted to have something a bit more engaging, a bit more dynamic, where you can ask any questions. Any of those blogs that you thought were really interesting, but you wanted to hear more, here is a chance where you get to do that. So, just a moment of housekeeping. We can't see your video and you're muted, but if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature, and we can also invite you to come off mute to elaborate if we want to hear more about your question. We're going to have about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes to present the content itself, to present that recent publication, and then we're going to have at least 10 minutes for audience questions. I know I have some questions that I want to ask, but I'm really excited to see some more of those come in. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. I'll be the facilitator today. My name is Bonnie Griffin. I'm a taxonomy consultant here at Enterprise Knowledge. And today, our special guest star is Sarah May O'Brien Scott. She is a principal consultant in the semantic design and modeling practice at Enterprise Knowledge, and she specializes in knowledge and semantic engineering. She has a lot of experience in metadata, taxonomy, ontology design, and knowledge graph implementations. And she also leads teams in semantic strategies and the design and implementation of semantic solutions. This is often focusing on recommendation engines and enterprise search, but goes far and beyond that as well. Most recently, the reason you're here is she authored the blog Top Ways to Get Your Content and Data Ready for AI, and she has generously agreed to talk us through this timely topic and answer your questions. So over to you, Sarah May. Talk to us about how to get your content and data ready for AI and why we should be doing that.
Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, I'm excited for this. Typically, I'm sitting in your seat of moderator for the Semantic Exchange, so it's fun to be able to share a piece that I worked on with EK's CEO Zach Wall. So he and I co-authored this. So definitely want to give credit there to Zach as well. Yeah, so let's get into this. The reason we wrote this blog is I think this was from back in September, so fall of last year. And it was about that time that we were really starting to hear a lot from organizations who had gone down the route of um, trying to figure out AI. You know, perhaps they had gone through some POCs, started some early work leveraging AI in different ways, and they were noticing that it wasn't working very well, oftentimes, or not as well as they needed it to in order to be, you know, the valuable return on investment that they were expecting. So looking at this through the lens of the work that we do at EK and the work that I specialize in at EK in terms of semantic design and modeling, the bit of the conversation that I wanted to bring to the table was around the knowledge assets themselves. So the role that content and data play in any AI sort of outcomes or work that you're using AI for within an organization. Data and content exists all over your organization. It's in various states, some better than others, as we well know, especially if it's existed over a long period of time, or you know, we just know that so much content and data is generated every day as we're going about our daily work. And so, given that it's not always ready to be used by AI solutions in a way that will be productive, will produce results that you would be expecting and that will be helpful for your use case. So semantics and some other aspects that we'll get into today are a big piece of helping your content get ready for those AI solutions, which will improve those outcomes that you're expecting for. So I have a couple of slides that summarize this piece, and I'll share those and talk through those a little bit as we get into this. This captures some of the main steps and considerations that Zach and I wrote about for this blog. And so this looks like a linear process, but often, and Bonnie and I and Justin as well, other EKers have worked on AI readiness projects, and we've gone through a lot of these steps together. And it's not as iterative as this slide is making it look. So oftentimes, you know, you might be jumping into structuring and then back to asset cleanup and things like that. But we'll go through these kind of in a row to give a sense of what each of those entails. I would love to hear any questions that you have regarding these. First up, you want to understand what knowledge assets are. So defining those knowledge assets. I mentioned earlier that we're talking about both data, which is structured, and content, which we often think about as unstructured. But based on whatever your use case is, you want to have a clear understanding of what content or data is important to that. And scope those knowledge assets based on what's in focus for the use case. We're also often thinking about, in terms of knowledge assets, perhaps knowledge that isn't even quite captured yet. And we'll get to that a little bit more with the identifying gaps step here. But obviously, your people at your organization have a lot of knowledge in their head. And so there are some interesting ways that we're thinking about capturing that knowledge so that it's a usable asset for AI solutions as well. So being very clear about, you know, which systems, perhaps, which types of content, which specific data will help answer the key questions that are part of your use case. That's where you want to focus your scope in. Once you have a sense of where your focus is to get ready for your AI solution, there's often a bit of cleanup that you need to do. And this looks like removing duplicated content or data, you know, getting stuff that looks very similar, that might create some noise, getting rid of outdated content or data. So anything that is no longer relevant or has perhaps been replaced by newer content. Removing those through automated processes is really helpful. So you can actually use AI, so different AI approaches in order to speed along or augment some of these steps. So it's not all as manual as it may have been in the past. For asset cleanup, we're also looking at the correctness and reliability of content. So sometimes that needs a little bit of SME review or guidance on what content should look like, what topics it should contain, what is sort of trustworthy and reliable in terms of what you might be serving up as part of your AI solution. I talked a little bit already about identifying gaps. And this is a really interesting part of the process because if you go back to that defining knowledge assets, and that's linking back to your use cases, you might actually find that you don't have all of the knowledge assets that you need in order to support those use cases. Um, Perhaps you are an HR organization within a company, and there's a new policy that has been released around medical leave. So you need to actually create content so that people have what they need to learn about that particular policy and can stay in line with that and learn what they need to about it. So one way that we're able to that we're able to identify gaps actually kind of comes back to this structuring piece, which is one of the steps we have a little bit later on. If you have good metadata tags on content, you're able to kind of search and see where things are not coming back. So if there are questions or queries that are being input into your AI solutions and there's basically no information coming back, that's a good way to identify that you have a gap. We'll also often look at things like search logs and resources like that to help us understand what is user behavior and how is that lining up with actual content or data that people are able to access to help along with those answers. There's also the tacit knowledge capture. There's some pretty interesting things we can do to fill some of these gaps identified in terms of how, we have all of these AI note-taking tools available to us that are happening during our meetings. So these are some great gold mines for finding that tacit knowledge in a little bit more of an explicit, expressed way via these notes and turning that into something that can be referenced and reused and built upon as a more formal knowledge asset. That's a little bit about gap identification. You're also able to generate knowledge assets using AI often. That's something that we're seeing a lot of, especially in organizations. Well, I would say this is maybe happening less in organizations that have more strict or stringent regulatory requirements that they must adhere to. So where there's maybe a little bit more freedom or less strictness in terms of risk or things like that, then organizations can use AI to help generate knowledge assets that answer questions that are being asked that maybe do not have corresponding assets in your base at the moment. So that's some interesting stuff that's happening there. Contextualize and structure, I'll talk about together. So they sort of go hand in hand for me. Contextualizing is adding meaning and consistency to these knowledge assets, often through things like metadata. So rather than just having a document kind of floating out there, you're anchoring it down with tags, including topics or regions or owners, things that help us better understand not only what is this piece about, what does it mean, but also how does it fit within the organization? Does it belong to a certain part of the organization? Should I have access to it? Different things like that. And then structure is where we're applying those tags. So we can classify again sometimes using AI methodologies for classification. So you can see that kind of simpatico relationship between using AI for AI readiness. So that's where those anchors come in as we're applying tags and creating that structure. Protect is really important, especially as organizations are making their knowledge assets more accessible and more visible through semantics. It's important to ensure that the right pieces of content are seen or accessible only to the right people. So sometimes in the past, content has remained secure or safe just by the fact that it was hard to find. And now some of those more, I would say, false measures of security are being debunked as your content becomes more accessible through semantics, through tagging and being able to find things more easily. So that's a little bit about some of the AI readiness steps and considerations. There's some more details in the blog. So if you're interested in that, please take a look. I'll also note the 5 Cs that we have listed across going horizontally across. These are ways that we measure AI readiness, and they're different metrics that we attach across these categories. But if we are wanting to understand if an AI solution is working on the basis of the content that we're giving it, then these are some of the categories that we're looking for. Is the content correct? Do we have all the right content? Do we have a complete set in order to serve this use case? Do we have this contextualized? Do we have a clear picture of what these knowledge assets are about? And then compliant kind of links back to protect, which I just talked through. So that's that. I'll just kind of briefly go through this slide, which is a little bit more about our framework for getting content ready. I mentioned, I'll go back to conduct asset cleanup and defining knowledge assets. This framework goes into some of those steps for AI readiness and even some of the others as well. So when we're wanting to get a clean set of content, good inputs for our AI solution, we want to make sure it's current, that there is lacking redundancy. We don't want to have a lot of duplicate content. We want content that is relevant to our use case and to the answers that we should be providing or the experience we should be providing through AI solutions. Accuracy, of course, is key. And then we get into structure and semantics, which I talked about too. One thing I like about this slide is that it also shows that relationship between tech-driven and human-driven workflows within the context of getting your content ready for AI. So it's not all on the people, but the people are still important, especially when it comes to accuracy, correctness, relevancy, kind of those more nuanced decisions that sometimes need to be made by humans as we're working with technology. Okay, so I think that's what I have as a bit of a recap for that article. So I will open it up for questions in our last 10 minutes or so, and would love to hear any thoughts that are coming to mind.
Yeah, so go ahead and pop those questions in the Q&A section if you get a chance, if you have any questions or comments you want to share. In the meantime, I want to share some questions that come up all the time and that I think about myself. So one thing that I've seen both as someone who's worked at other organizations and just anecdotally, with people I know other places, realistically, your organization is never going to audit all of your knowledge assets. That's just simply not going to be a thing, especially for a large organization. So, out of everything, basically, what are the best places to start? How do you prioritize the most important knowledge assets and then, backlog the rest?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that our clients, as we begin working with them, are often struggling with a little bit. What I've seen be most successful is when those decisions are made based on a use case that provides, clear value for an organization and also has a clear path to success. So you have sort of the right components in place in order to make the progress you need to make to show the value. So a lot of times with an AI POC, you're in the experimental phase. You want to understand, is this actually going to work for my organization? And so there are choices to make to ensure that what you're working on, what the solution is doing, is actually aligned strategically to what is important to your business or to the outcomes that your business wants to see. So starting from there, picking a good use case, and then mapping out what are those knowledge assets that need to be in support of that use case. Some ways to, I guess, double click on that a little bit. I think I mentioned already, we might be reviewing, questions that are asked in a knowledge base within an organization and kind of figuring out where are there not clear resolutions for those questions and kind of focusing in on that as a potential area for focusing on audits and things like that. So that's where my mind goes first with that question. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks. Another question that I was thinking of, and then I see that we have one in the chat that we'll get to next. So, what about organizations, which I think this is most, if not all of them, right, have already gone all in on AI solutions and keep getting the message, just use AI for everything, even though the content isn't ready for it, the data isn't ready for it, and you just know that this possibly isn't going to go very well. So, if you want to demonstrate that taking that time and effort to do those audits to make your content ready is worth the effort, do you have any recommendations for setting up a small proof of concept and just doing a little experiment to show on a small, manageable scale that outcomes are much better after doing that work?
Yeah, so that kind of builds on the last response I gave around choosing a good use case that's aligned to strategy. But what I think can sink, or, it's like a sink or swim situation in terms of having the right metrics to demonstrate that success. So AI solutions, especially when we're using generative AI, it's a little bit slippery. We hear about the black box, and there are things that come out that you don't fully understand why. And so there's a lot of kind of tinkering and assessing that goes into understanding the outcomes, the outputs rather, that you're getting from an AI solution. So having clear metrics for how you want to measure what is a good output, and then having an understanding of what are all the variables that go into influencing an output. Because again, in generative AI solutions, it's not fully baked. It's a little bit more of an influence situation rather than a direct situation there. So having that understanding, the clear metrics, what are we measuring, what's important to us, how are we going to show from A to B that this is a better or worse solution, if it's working or not. And then also, what are the things that we should be thinking about tweaking along the way to help us get to a better output from our AI solution.
It looks like our Q&A question is going to let us keep staying in this same general theme and maybe get a little bit
Nice.
more specific. So, speaking of metrics, speaking of, a lot of what you've already touched on, we have a question from Patrick. I'm going to go ahead and read that. So, structured data quality is a well-defined area of practice in the industry. What are good ways to approach and evaluate unstructured data quality or semantic quality? What terms are used to describe this area of practice? So, I don't know if we want to talk about the 5 Cs, some of those maturity assessments that we do, kind of where your brain goes.
Yeah, definitely. Good ways for evaluating unstructured data quality. So I will go to the 5 Cs that I mentioned. In fact, I can share those again just so we have something to look at together. Um, this is a framework that has been really helpful for us as we're having to go into working in different environments that have different requirements and things like that. So here, I'm pulling this up. So what we often find is those metrics need to be a little bit tailored to what's most important to an organization. So I gave the example of, correctness. Obviously, we always want our unstructured content to be correct. but sometimes that's more important in certain domains or industries, such as, the healthcare industry, the financial domain. So these are areas that are more regulated or have higher stakes when it comes to correctness. Um, so that is one choice that we might be making in terms of evaluating unstructured data quality or semantic quality is that an area of focus that we need to focus on. Um, I would say other things that we look to are, again, completeness. So this is looking actually typically at the broader corpus of content that you have. Do you have everything that you need, that your end user might expect to see, or that's needed to get to certain kinds of questions, things like that. So those are a couple of the things that come to mind. Bonnie, do you have any thoughts here as I know we've worked on some of these things together?
No, those are the main things. I can't think of what I would add apart from just if there's anything specific to your organization that requires a little bit of extra tailoring, like especially around that compliance area, if this is something
Mm,
like healthcare or education or finance, something where there are additional considerations there, I think that's one where, you'd have to do a little bit of extra work, a little bit of extra homework to define, you know, ways to
mhm,
evaluate unstructured data quality or semantic quality, maybe in terms of risk or in terms of, you know, compliance within those industries. That's the only thing that I
mhm.
can think of. Um,
Yeah, as you're talking through that, another thought came to mind, which is sort of the freshness of the content. And hopefully there's good metadata in place to help you determine this. If there's metadata saying what version this content is, or, when it was last updated, when it was created, those are kinds of things to look at. Again, that's the context around the unstructured data itself. But those are some things that we look at as well.
Great. It looks like we have time for just one more question. One thing that I think would be really interesting to hear about is whether there's a recommended order to these readiness efforts. I know you have that laid out here, but simplifying things. You've mentioned content cleanups, content models, taxonomies, ontologies. Which come first? Because it looks like they fit in across this order.
That's a good question. And I think, dep it could make sense to enter into this in different ways, depending on where you are. So sometimes we work with an organization and their focus, there's a big effort around developing the semantic layer. And so, there might be a little bit more focus on that contextualize and structure part of things in terms of AI readiness and steps and considerations, versus, maybe you're not quite to the content cleanup phase of things. I would say you always, almost always, probably always want to start with the definition of your knowledge assets, because it all leads back to that. Like, what are the things that you need to describe? What will people be interacting with? What is supplying the answers for the AI solution? That's where it all sort of begins. So understanding your use case and what are those assets that are going to be part of that. I don't think you can often get around that, if ever.
Well, I think that's a really good note for us to end on. And again, we are easy to find on LinkedIn if you want to ask any additional questions. As I mentioned, Enterprise Knowledge has that great knowledge base on our website if you want to see what other blogs and webinars and infographics and other great resources we have there. I know that's how I learned a lot about taxonomy and ontology and these things before joining. So keep an eye out if you want to share this with anyone else, go ahead and have them enroll, and we'll be able to share that link and the recording to the video. We will also share out the recorded meeting in a little bit, so you can go ahead and share this internally, anything like that. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Sarah May, for talking us through the blog you wrote with Zach on how to get content and data ready for AI. Thank you all.
Thanks for the questions. Take care.